Scott, welcome to DAO Talk. Thanks for joining us. Super stoked to have you here.
Awesome. Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, why don't you just get us started? Tell us a little bit about your background, kind of how you got into crypto, Web3, and then what you're working on now.
Yeah, so I've been in the space since 2015, which is kind of wild to think about at this point. I think that there's a bunch of things that actually got me interested in the space to start, but mostly I was doing like kind of machine learning and finance and sort of like Web2 TM. And I feel like most of my interest actually came from just trying to find things that were not that in Toronto at the time. And there were just a bunch of meetups that started happening up until the Frontier launch. And I just kind of slowly realized, wait a minute, like most of what I'm working on here is actually just like kind of made up. Like it's sort of an abstraction that like we've just gotten used to over the last like 20, probably longer than 20 years. But like, I think with that sort of realization, I couldn't really go back, and I just sort of like started thinking about how do I get involved in the space? What do I like want to do with this sort of like idea, like this knowledge? And that was kind of what got me started. In 2016, I started a project that failed terribly because as everyone sort of like does, I think
rite of passage.
Rite of passage for sure. The DAO hack happened. We were trying to work on actually things that were related to like DAO tooling at the time, which was just kind of the idea of like, hey, like everyone's raising, all this money based on the idea that like, you have to work with VCs, you have to work with like large capital providers. In Canada, the markets are even worse, I think, than in the US in this regard. Like all the family offices, all these like kind of older generation like markets are like, we love like not crypto mining. They love like mining, like gold mining. And like that's the market. And so, I was like, well, what if founders could just raise equity between each other, like have like founder collectives? But then of course with the DAO hack, no one really wanted to talk about DAOs for a while. So, but that was kind of my first introduction to like, hey, what would it mean to like actually build something in the space? And yeah, I haven't really looked back since.
Awesome. I feel like I've met a bunch of people who are from Toronto that got into it. I'm relatively new, but I feel like I read The Infinite Machine. I feel like there's a lot of like Ethereum stuff happening in Toronto early on.
Yeah, it was like the kind of hub for like, Vitalik started Ethereum there. There's a house on Spadina where like a lot of people were, I wasn't super deep in it at that point, but like a lot of people in Toronto kind of rallied around the idea because like Vitalik and other sort of early folks were out there talking about it just because that's where they were. And I think ultimately a lot of the interest sort of like, should have probably remained in Canada, but of course, it's not the most friendly environment for these sorts of things. And so naturally, I think people kind of like gravitated, like distributed across the world a little later on. But yeah, I feel like a lot of my best experiences came actually from a set of meetups that were run by, I think Nick Dodson, Fuel Labs now.
Okay, cool.
And he just like taught people, like you had to like sync your node before you could like actually do anything. And it took like 10 minutes to sync the node. So we'd all just wait for that to happen. And then, like folks like Richard Moore from Ethers.js were there. And he was just involved in like, trying to almost with Nick, like compete to make like a really like kind of tiny library for like doing all this stuff like on the JavaScript side. And those sorts of experiences didn't feel like formative at the time. They just were things that were like kind of randomly happening. And I think in hindsight, it's easier to build like a narrative and think like, oh, this was like, where it all happened in a sense.
Yeah.
But I really think it was just kind of like a nice kind of fun happenstance environment. And what made it great was just that we were all kind of on like Friday night, like we didn't have anything better to do. And we're just like, well, why don't we just go and hang out and like try and figure out what this thing is all about.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And in a lot of times, like in retrospect, those experiences are the most fun too.
Yeah.
Like I've had this experience working at like Web2 startups where in the beginning, early on, it's very hard, and like objectively speaking, 5 years later, the company's really big. You have all these like nice perks and stuff. Like on an objective basis, it's like better, but you kind of like, I don't know, you almost like want there's something special about it just being like hard and like people only being there because they wanted to be, and then
Absolutely.
Later on, it kind of becomes like almost like an obligation. So yeah, I can definitely appreciate that feeling.
Yeah.
I recently like joined crypto like full time and kind of dove into the DAO space like 4 or 5 months ago. And it was so much smaller than I thought, because there's a lot of people who like to like tweet about DAO stuff, like DAO this, DAO that. It's kind of like
Absolutely.
low hanging fruit. So I assumed it was like, relatively big industry within crypto. And as soon as I jumped in, I was like, no, there's probably like, hundreds of like active in any way decentralized DAOs, not thousands, And I was like, that's crazy. Like, it's so early. So I'm hoping like, we're kind of in a similar formative period, and we look back 5 years from now and be like, wow, that was fun.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel like, if you look at Twitter, and this was kind of the problem with like the bull market. I think we're kind of I think everyone would admit we're in a bit of a bear market now. Like, everyone was like, this is it. This is like the future. Like, I'm all in on like DAOs. Like, okay, but like we're making incremental progress. These are not things that are going to happen overnight. Any major shift in society, whether it's social, technological, whatever, takes usually decades to actually play out. And I think we have this expectation in the moment that like this thing exists, and therefore now it's like, should just be everywhere all at once. And I think the mindset shift everyone goes through when they go through their first like sort of cycle in the space is realizing like, wait, it's all kind of, iterative, and like this just happens like over time, over and over. And I think for people that are going through like their, first cycle now, I think that's the biggest realization to have is it's not that like, oh, it's like over. It's that like, this is just like another iteration that's like happening. And that's actually really healthy in a sense. So like, yeah, I mean, you talk about DAOs in that way. I think NFTs especially are like in that kind of stage of just being like, let's just slap an NFT on it. Like that's like the future. And yeah, I think that like having experimentation is really good, but also like, in both those contexts, just realizing like how small the space is and like how narrow the sort of like, explorations we've made so far are is just like super important for like, perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I like about both DAOs and NFTs that I think has contributed to the hype is that they create surface area for a different type of person to get involved in Ethereum. I was talking earlier today to Brian from Sarah Space. He like is a historically like Web2 consumer product UX designer, and he's pretty new to Web3, but they've already built this like really cool like minting experience just because he has that like background of like, okay, how do I put my consumer hat on and create something that like makes sense to someone who isn't an expert on what's happening on the back end. And so I think like that's part of the reason DAOs and NFTs have blown up, because there's all these people like, artists, like people like myself with a background in B2B software, like they see things and they're like, oh, crypto's cool. And like, this is something I can actually do versus like, cryptographic research, like is a pretty specific, background to have. But I also think, it's like everyone jumped in and now we're like, well, actually a lot of these things don't work. but that's like you said, it's just part of the process. And even if you look at DAOs, even though there's a lot of things that didn't work or things that called us DAOs that really aren't DAOs, there are like an early set of different approaches that are working well, right? Like I think, if you look at something like Gitcoin, you look at something like ENS, Compound, Nouns DAO, like they all have like slightly different mechanisms and do slightly different things. They also have their own set of problems, but like you can see they're sort of like these early seeds that are actually, working. And I think, will blossom going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we haven't really explored a lot of different models for DAOs. And I think that like, even in the context of Gitcoin, I think we've done a really good job of trying to iterate on the sort of Uniswap, like Governor Alpha sort of model of like, how do you do DAO governance? I think ENS and then like Optimism and others have also done a really good job iterating on that. I think the challenge to me right now is mostly thinking about scale. Like, I think we talk about DAOs as like many different things, and we don't really properly differentiate between the types of things we're talking about. So, for example, like everyone's familiar with the concept of like, especially after Squad Wealth, like the other internet posts, like of a squad. You have like your group, you have like a group chat, you have like people hanging out and like doing things together. Sometimes like even finding like ways to like find value together, like make money together. Those things just naturally happen at small scales. I think a lot of DAOs have kind of, especially in the bull market, had the idea that like, oh, you can just scale that infinitely and just have vibes with like 10,000 people and like you'll just like, that'll like work. I think it does work for certain types of organizations, but like for many, like especially larger communities or large organizations, that doesn't scale. And that's when you need like other ways to find alignment between groups. You need other forms of structure. And I think that's where people start to lose like the plot a little bit. I think a lot of people are like, well, like if you have structure, if you have any kind of like, model of interaction between like groups that is like has any kind of, for example, hierarchy, even if it's like, or leadership in some cases. Like sometimes like those things can be seen as not a DAO. Like people talk about like dinos. And I think there's actually valid like ideas to like what a dino is. But I think it's really important for us to start to think about like what are the different types of organizations we're making? What are the trade-offs we're making? And how do we make those trade-offs in a way that like actually one does like legitimately push us forward in terms of the way we're thinking about organizations, but two, does so in a way that actually like functionally and like productively gets us to the actual outcomes, like the mission, like driven, like outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And I think that's where I'm really excited for DAOs to go, like in the next like kind of year, is just towards this goal of actually thinking through like, what are we here for? Maybe it is vibing, but I think it's often a broader, like more sort of like deep rooted mission and purpose. And I think without that, it's going to be very difficult to find an organization, to find a DAO that functions effectively. So
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a long, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I definitely vibe with that. One of the things that I've been thinking about is like, I don't think DAOs necessarily need traditional titles or like permissioned authority, but they do need leaders. Like, it just maybe looks different, but like ultimately leadership is necessary within groups of humans to really activate like everyone's potential. And so I think some DAOs or people have been like afraid of that concept, but I think it's something that in some ways, I think it requires more leadership, actually, like better or more elevated leadership to really make progress in a DAO, where it's like you can influence what others are doing, but in a way that is like entirely permissionless for you and them. It's almost like we need more, more leadership, because in a traditional centralized like company, you can have a title but not be a leader at all. Like you can just be like the vice president of blank and you just like chill. Like, not that I've ever seen that before. Definitely have, whereas in a DAO, like hopefully you could still have like whatever the equivalent of like VP level influence is, just in terms of like you're helping many different groups like achieve goals, or one group tackle something really big, but not because someone like bestowed that title upon you, but because you sort of like earned that through leadership. So I think that's like one thing. And then you also mentioned like, okay, scale is really important. I think it's a great point. And like, I think it's really important to understand like whatever like the most scaled organizations today are. So the US government or various like federal offices, Google, Walmart, the YMCA, like just these massive, like whatever the biggest like centralized organizations you can think of are, probably, church, like Catholic Church, like et cetera. They exist, but like if you've ever worked in any of those organizations, like it's also very painful. Like how do you scale up coordination between many people is not actually a well-solved problem. So it's important to understand that like, yes, DAOs are going through growing pains, but like, I think some of the people who are like, DAOs are never going to work have just never worked in a giant organization, because it's like exceptionally dysfunctional.
Well, a lot of people haven't worked in like, I mean, a lot of people have started their jobs now in Web3, which is actually kind of interesting to see. Like it's a good thing that that's happening. On the other hand, a lot of people kind of reinvent like ideas or processes that have existed before. I think actually, like to your point about like kind of, and this is one of the challenges, like I did use the word hierarchy, and I think there's like nuance to like the way in which you use that word. Like there's things that can be seen as hierarchical, which are like ultimately like very, very like pernicious, toxic, bad. Then there's like other ways to look at it, like other types of hierarchy that are like very, very valuable. And a lot of it comes down to like, what is the mechanism by which, like power is distributed, and then like by which influence is leveraged. On the one hand, I think, you can have this sort of like hard power, which I think is usually like less effective than like finding alignment. But like as organizations scale, the like returns you get on alignment are like almost decay, like in a sort of like logarithmic sense. Like, you do need eventually to have like some balance between structure and alignment that like takes shape. But the interesting thing that I've learned a lot from has been like, to your point. And so on the one hand, yes, you need like to look back at like what has happened in previous organizations. Like that's kind of the key point there. On the other hand, I think folks like David Ehrlichman, who wrote the book Impact Networks, have done a really good job of highlighting how to kind of flip, not necessarily flip those models on their head, but like provide really kind of like structured like changes and like actionable ways to kind of lead in a slightly more non-hierarchical way. And I think there's like a really interesting movement happening. Like folks like Rafa from Mirror are also sort of, I think, really involved in this discussion and have done a really good job highlighting some of these ideas. But we're essentially asking ourselves, like, what can we take from this previous era of like organization? And then what can we add that's like not really being tried at large scale before? And I think that's where a lot of the like best insights will come from, not from like us just kind of like digging in, like being like, I invented this entirely new framework for a thing. And, you know, like we don't want to look back at like anything that's happened before, but also not by stagnating and kind of, you know, saying, well, this is how Google runs its like internal, you know, project teams. And so here's how we should do it. I mean, Google is infamously like extremely like dysfunctional, right? So, I mean, already a terrible example there, but there's just so many, I think, we are very bad at nuance, especially on Twitter. And I think that's very important for us to like, as we, you know, start to, now we actually have a bit of time in the bear market to like step back and think about deeply, what are we actually trying to do? I think that's where we should like start to really have these conversations together and have them in a way that's, you know, kind of productive and start to think about the solutions together.
I think it takes a lot of courage to look at something that is struggling, right? It's like, once you get really close to a problem, you just see it really clearly, you know, so you see all the gaps. And so you look at like, you know, DAOs as they exist today, it's like, there's a lot of really clear problems, you know. It's hard for governance tokens to retain value. Like we don't have effective Sybil resistance. It's really hard to like create like aligned communities and make sure that, you know, don't become toxic. Like I could go on, I'm sure you could do, but like I think that's really true of any problem space. And like what leadership is and like what, you know, I think is like sort of the courageous thing to do is to be like, cool, I acknowledge this and like here's what we're going to try next.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
And I think we'll see a lot of folks who are willing to do that. Maybe not a lot in number, but like enough, you know, that are willing to do that over the course of this bear market that will come outside on the other side looking different.
Yeah. I think it's almost like a lot of leadership is also iteration, the same way that the space is cycles. I think leadership has cycles. And I think any, you know, organization that succeeds is going to go through different eras. For us, I think we've been relatively lucky in the sense that the way we structured governance initially did have a lot of checks and balances in place, but we still, you know, a lot of people with delegated governance talk about the challenge of like steward engagement. How do you make sure people are like following kind of the rules or like that they're interacting with proposals in an informed way? Those are things that like we, I think, started off relatively strong on, but like we still had to work very hard to actually make sure that those things remain the case. And I think that like it's very easy to, yeah, just get kind of complacent and be like, well, this is like kind of, you know, how things have worked or, you know, how we're doing things now, and we're not gonna change. So I think leadership is a lot about how do you actually iterate and kind of guide that iteration over time.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you talked about the challenges of scale. Like, you gave the example of like squad wealth versus Constitution DAO. I don't know if you meant Constitution DAO.
Oh, no, but that's very
that's like the
relevant.
other end of the spectrum, right?
Yeah.
It's like that's like extreme squad, permissionless, like
Yeah.
40,000 person squad wealth. So like Gitcoin's gone through a similar process where like I wasn't around for the first Gitcoin grant round, but I've heard it was like pretty small. And now you're matching millions, you know, every quarter. So would love for you to elaborate, like, you know, as you've gone through that process of scale and also looking forward, hopefully 10xing again, like what are some of the challenges that you have faced and you think you will face going forward?
One of the things that I think, we started with a 25K, I think, round in round one. And then now I think the matching pool for GR14, which I don't know when this will actually come out. It's still ongoing now, but it might not be ongoing by the time this releases. And the iterations on the product side have been a really big part, I think, of just our own growth. And for a long time, those were separate from the DAO. Those were like totally independent. But now, like, I mean, everything is pretty much being ported over, which was actually a really interesting process. I mean, like kind of moving from like a centralized organization to like a DAO is its own like kind of like learning. And Jesse Walden has written a lot about this better than I can articulate it in terms of like progressive decentralization. But I mean, a lot of what we've learned, I think, over that time period is just being beyond the organizational learnings, has been around like, how do people interact with incentives? I think everyone in crypto learns about this. And like, I think there's something to be said in that context for Constitution DAO and like the squad wealth stuff you mentioned, which is like a whole different tangent. They kind of ran into the problem of like more organizationally, like they basically just like scaled, I think, the team too quickly, and like they lost that alignment from growing past a squad level. They grew past like being a true squad. But like Gitcoin Grants always was like already at a scale, even from round one, where it was like past Dunbar's number. There were like, I think even like a couple thousand donors in the first round. There were a decent number of grantees. I think there were like maybe 50 grantees. It was like, now it's like 3,000 or 4,000 or something.
Yeah.
But what we learned is that in terms of incentives, yeah, people really like to, like, for example, like farm airdrops. There's like lots of these things that happen. People will always try and find ways to game, anything that has like a possible Sybil attack vector.
Yep.
There's lots of ways, which quadratic funding, of course, like has like as a kind of core part of it. If you donate many times, basically you'll end up with way more matching funding if you pretend you're 8 people, let's say, versus if you have 2 people donating $4 each. The matching amount would be like naively square the sum of the square roots of contributions, 16. And then if you had 8 people donate $1 each, you would get 64. So it's like a massive difference.
Right.
And yeah, people will game that. The other piece, I think, is just like people like generally want to be valued and rewarded for their work without articulating their outcomes sometimes. I don't think this is actually like always the case, but like I think sometimes this is true with DAOs in terms of just traditional centralized grants programs too.
Yep.
But I think often it's very difficult to, find people that will effectively, follow milestones or like kind of like engage with their community. I think over time, we've managed to find a ton of grantees that are willing to do that. And I think a large percentage of people on the platform now do. But I think that like the natural instinct is still kind of against that. I think it's generally like, I did this thing, like, please, like now, like this should be like, just like valued. And to be fair, to some degree, they're not wrong. Like to some degree, they should, be rewarded. Like, and this is what we're like, talking about with retroactive public goods funding. We've done some work with Optimism on this too, like retroactively for their work. But on the other hand, I think people need to be willing to like showcase what they've created and like kind of be willing to like put themselves out there to some degree. Even before crypto, that was like an incredibly important thing, like like an exponential kind of like thing to do for your own growth and for like.
Right.
So there's a lot of like tangents I can go on in terms of like what have we learned from like the product from like Gitcoin Grants itself, but like. Yeah. I think those are really interesting. Like there's like probably, and I think some people have written papers on this, which probably are much better than like my explanations here, but like people writing about like, yeah, what are the learnings from like a mechanism design perspective? And then also just from like a like human behavior perspective from like these kinds of communities at scale. Cause again, like the way that those things work past Dunbar's number is just very different from the sort of mode of a squad.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great answer. Yeah,
it's a bit long, but
I think it's really cool that you guys have implemented quadratic voting in the wild, right? Because to your point, it's certainly like Sybil resistance hasn't been solved, yet in crypto. I haven't dug deep into mechanism design or read output, but like I feel like despite the fact that Gitcoin keeps scaling up, thus more incentive for Sybil attacks, like the mechanism is still held up well. So I certainly like, would point to like even just not the Gitcoin DAO, but even just the mechanism design as like a form of decentralization that is like working to some degree at scale in crypto.
I would credit the DAO actually with a lot of that, to be honest. I think that like we have like 5 work streams right now. One of them is like around public goods funding, which does like operations for the rounds, does fundraising. One of them is sort of like a incubation sort of space, Moonshot Collective. Austin Griffith's doing a lot of that work there. We have a work stream for sort of like fraud detection, which is like where a lot of the Sybil resistance work and like mechanism design happens. Michael Zargum, like the block science team, and like, a bunch of others like have done really great work in this area and have also like been sort of more on the academic side writing papers there.
That's really cool.
But yeah, there's like a lot of those I mean, I was going to like list off all the work streams, but anyway, there's a bunch of them.
Yeah.
We're like actually getting to the point of launching like more thin work streams, like to try and keep the surface area of like accountability really clear, because that's one of the challenges that you, I think, run into. Honestly, like again, like I'm gonna keep like name dropping things that like are better references, but like Linda Z like has written a really good post that I helped out with, that was like her learnings from being a delegate in the Gitcoin context. But like, yeah, all these things that the product is doing effectively are really coming from, at this point, the DAO, and have sort of like for the last like 4, I think, rounds at this point, like being mostly driven that way.
That's awesome. Yeah, you mentioned over time the DAO has made more of an impact on the product itself.
Yeah. Well, and like really cool. It's been, many rounds since the DAO launch, but also, I mean, still the majority were when we were like a centralized company. And I think that we've actually learned a lot from the rounds where we haven't been really like directly at the wheel, and we've been able to see how like the community kind of evolves the process. So from that perspective, like I'm just like excited to see where things go. And like it makes me optimistic about like, yeah, like even in spite of like, yes, there's challenges to DAOs, the fact that like, hey, you can run something that like functionally has an impact, like in the real world, even, I mean, with the context we're doing like the climate round, without needing to have crazy sorts of like innovations in terms of like governance systems, or massive changes in terms of like the way that you think about like work streams or pods or whatever you want to call like these like smaller working groups. Those are all like ideas that have existed for a while, for a long time. And to like going back to the David Ehrlichman sort of like impact networks point, be restructured or reimagined in a new context. But like you can still do a lot with that I think we're doing well on the Gitcoin side with, but we're, as an ecosystem, I think probably not giving enough like credence or like credit to.
Yeah. It's like, it kind of gets back to like what I was mentioning about like courage. It's like people who are willing to build with the tools that we have today and are like making an impact, getting stuff done in a way that is like legitimately decentralized, at least on some level. It's like super impressive. And you're right, like it is happening, even as like all these tools come on board. It makes me like really bullish on DAOs and decentralization, actually, like how like rough the tooling is, like that's something that I've learned like about myself. Like I really like to operate in spaces where it's just like extremely painful, but like something is there, because that actually is very bullish, right? It's like there is DAO work happening. There are people who are working permissionlessly. There is decentralized trust that exists. And yet, like every single part of the process, there's like so many obvious potential improvements, that could be made. I think it speaks well, to the potential going forward.
Yeah, I feel like the tooling we have is not very good in many cases. I think there is like, I mean, for example, like we use Tally. Tally is still like super like impactful in terms of just allowing the stewards to be able to functionally vote on like and like get involved in proposals in a way that like if you had to actually interact with the contracts and like do all that work would be like extremely like cumbersome and just not realistic for people to be able to pursue. So I think from that perspective, it's good. But I think we are still quite early on in terms of tooling. And despite that, we're still doing very well. And I think that both speaks to probably like an over indexing on like the tooling versus the social processes, and just like the kind of like ways that you build sort of trust and build a kind of like just like organizational like alignment.
Yep.
But like at the same time, like shows that, there's a lot more that we can do that like hasn't been done yet that will even like further increase like the way these things like evolve. So I think that's like really important. But the other thing that I want to like very quickly call out, like, which it was just kind of in this vein, because I mean, on Twitter now, I think you do see a lot of people like, especially, I think that, naturally people will follow the trends. So when things are going really well, people are like, DAOs are the future. I'm all in on DAOs. Like that's like everything is like, and that's wrong. Like that's like incorrect. Like you can't say like it's too just hyperbolic in one direction. And then when things really go poorly, people are like, DAOs are done. Like there's no point in DAOs.
Governance is a joke.
It's the end.
Just by pointing out like the worst failures.
And I think both of those perspectives are like pretty like not like I don't think intentionally disingenuous, but like they're just like very it's an unfortunate reality of the way that like we interact on social media, that like those things like tend to be the defaults. And I think that what we need to think about instead is just like, how do we kind of like, call things out as needed, but avoid cynicism in a way that's like helping to push the ecosystem forward. By the way, like, I mean, I still love Twitter and I still think there's lots of things that are like great there. And like, but like, I do think that it's a very, I mean, it's funny because it also happens like in the context of, I'm sure, like many different like DAO governance processes. I know there's like something that happened with, I don't remember the exact details, like with phase governance recently that was like called out, and like that was a whole thing. I think there are things that are, like important to call out and so forth, but like, and there's still lots of like good things to draw from that on Twitter. But often, we just run into this problem of these extremes.
I think a lot of the people that are like the loudest about DAOs being like everything in the bull market and then also never, ever, ever going to work in the bear market don't actually work in DAOs.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
pretty much. Yeah. It's like people who are like, I kind of like, I've heard of DAOs. Like I have an idea like from like having heard of them of what I can say about them, but like that doesn't make me an expert. I think anyone that tells you they're a DAO expert is like, that's a great sign that like they have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Because like no one is an expert in that space yet. And I think that is fundamentally kind of a good thing in the current context.
One thing that we've been talking about at Tally, I wanted to circle back to your point about like, we need better tooling in terms of like software platforms like Tally, but also just like practices, standards, like things like that. We've been having that realization at Tally too. That's actually one of the reasons we're like doing this podcast and this event and all this stuff is like, we realize like a tool doesn't just have to be software. In fact, like we need better software, but like that may not even be like what is most needed at any given time to help DAOs move forward. And like, if you think about DAO tooling startups like Tally, like the most, if you were to like make a pitch deck and list the risks, the number one risk for all of them is DAOs never achieving scale, right? So much so that like all the other risks are actually like not that important right now. We as a community just need to figure out, okay, like how can we help DAOs move forward? Because like we all need that, we're all betting on that. And so I think you're right. And like that's even something as like a software provider where we're like, okay, I mean, it's marketing for us to do this, but it's also just like, we kind of need to help like outside of just the product through conversations like this to help DAOs, even just figure out like standards, working together, like who's trying what and like what isn't working and what is working, and stuff like that. Cause I think you're right. We've been talking about community a lot, just randomly internally. It's like, okay, all DAOs are like experiencing various challenges with managing their community and then also having some successes. It's like, how can we distill that down? Like if you were to make a tool for community, it might be software, or it might just be like a list of like recommended like tips and tricks for like how you set expectations, how like what behavior is permissible or not, how do you explain your values, like all that stuff. So I think you're absolutely right. Like even on our side, where obviously our like main focus is software tools, we're realizing like a lot of what needs to happen is also just like learning about how to work together more effectively in the DAO context.
Yeah, I feel like we use the term similar to like DAO, like we use the term community in a lot of different ways. And Richard Bartlett's done a really good job highlighting like different scales of community over time. So like you have like the individual, like as its own, like the self, like just as a community. You have like sort of like small, like sort of like dyads. You have like, squads. You have like and as you go like and scale up, like the thing you mean by community is like very different. And so the same way that in the context of like DAOs, we're sort of like very, very, it's a very nebulous term. We're like not doing a good job defining it. I think we have made the mistake with tooling for communities of saying like, oh, you're a community? Well, here's your Discord.
Yeah.
Like, here's your like, here's
you
your
have a
like
general
chat
channel and you have an announcements channel.
And like those are just not like, there's no mapping that's going to always work. Like there's always like, I think it's funny because like when we talk about like decentralization, like we do often talk about that in terms of like, how do we have lots of like smaller DAOs versus like, one large DAO, which I think is like very valid, like the idea of like sub DAOs, the idea of like all these concepts. But I think when we talk about like tooling, we often don't make the same distinction. Like we often are
Yeah.
just like very kind of stuck with like, hey, like this is the tool for DAOs. And that, yeah, it's definitely a mistake to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, really appreciate that. Just like back and forth. I feel like I could continue this all day, but you're probably busy, and I have a lot more interviews to do. So I just want to like transition, kind of like as we come to a close. Would love to get just your general take. Two parts to the question. One, what is one thing that like you love about working in crypto Web3 DAOs, like that just gets you up every morning? And then what's one thing that like if you could change it, you would, or maybe you're actively working on improving in space?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of things that are really great about it. But the one thing to me is that you are kind of very organically, in ways that I don't think really exist in other organizations, finding sort of your people by just sort of like providing a beacon of like sort of the mission that you're on and the goals you're trying to achieve, and people kind of like rallying around that in ways that eventually like kind of just almost by happenstance, at least luckily in our case, lead to a team that's like very values aligned, that's like really interested in working on these things together. That to me is like, maybe harder to do in other contexts where you don't have like this sort of like light switch, like activation of like a global community that can like work with you on something. And then in addition, I just think that like going back to the point about experimentation, like there's so many things here. Like I studied math and political science actually in undergrad. And like a lot of that was actually originally me thinking like, oh, maybe I'll do law school, maybe I'll do something around like voting systems. Like, and that experimentation is also just fascinating to me because it's, if you look back at the last 200, whatever, even more years, like we mostly just have systems that like, again, going back to the absurdism that we've stuck with because of no real reason. Like we just stuck with them because we're like, this is like what exists in the world. And I guess that's what we got. And I think now we actually are, even though it's imperfect, like giving ourselves tools and like kind of like even just a mindset shift around the idea that we can just start building new sort of like systems and new institutions.
Yeah.
And that to me is really exciting. In terms of the challenges, I think probably like all the stuff, like we mentioned a bunch of those things,
Yeah.
but like there's, with any of that innovation, with anything that's happening that's like very new, there's bound to be a lot of like problems. I feel like I do spend like a decent amount of time, or at least have historically, like putting out some kind of fire. Whether because, and I think that's like especially true in like just crypto generally. There's always something happening. There's always like some kind of new like evolution of the space. And sometimes that can get really tiring. I think like mental health in Web3 is like a very important like conversation that I know like folks like 2Plus and others are doing good work on. So that to me is like the only thing. It is a 24/7 like constant like ecosystem. And I do think one thing we could probably do better is figure out like how do we provide some kind of like balance or like return to like kind of a rhythm of like interaction that's a bit more like sustainable. I do think in the current market, it's probably going to be easier to do.
Sure.
But yeah, I think those are like, obviously also just growing pains. So
Yeah, those are great takes. Yeah, crypto 24/7, 365 is tough. And also a lot of the platforms we use are just really hard. Like, I am doing like marketing community stuff. So each day I just rotate like internal Slack at Tally, email, Telegram, Discord, my personal Twitter, Tally's Twitter, like 6 things every day, like all day, right? And many of those platforms, like I find myself being like, man, email is dope. And the reason I find myself thinking about that is because like something about the way the form factor is, it doesn't create an expectation for an immediate response. Whereas like a lot of these other platforms, like Discord, Telegram in particular, I'll call out, it's like the way everything is set up is almost like live chat. But like the fact that we're trying to do this like deep work in this like live chat tool in a market platform that's 24/7, 365 global permissionless is just wild. Like it's definitely harsh, like, and I think, like whether it's like just being conscious of mental health or like thinking about our tools, like you talked about for a community. I think there's a lot of work to do to try to make it like we should be incentivized to do it because we all work in the space. Like, let's get together to be like, let's work less, let's work better. Yeah, let's work more healthily. I don't know. Anyway, to close, one non-crypto question. So, what is your favorite place in the world and why?
The no. I was gonna say the metaverse.
Yeah,
no, I feel like that's a tough question. I feel like there's too many.
Your favorite place is Telegram.
That's
while
right.
You're being blown up on Sunday morning.
That's right. Only Telegram.
Yeah.
I mean, we are in New York. I do really love New York as a city. My sort of like probably favorite space is still, maybe it ties it back together, I guess. Still probably like Toronto. I do love Toronto as a city. It has its challenges as a city too, but like, you know, I'm still spending a lot of time there and I still think it's like, still underrated. It's underrated, except for maybe, I don't know, like I guess Drake hypes it up as a city, but like beyond that. But yeah, I think that like, that's, you know, one of many places, but yeah, it's one of my favorites.
That's awesome. I lived in Michigan for a couple years and made the trek to Toronto for a long weekend. And yeah, it's an amazing city. It's super beautiful. It's like so diverse too. Like there's so many different neighborhoods with like completely different, kind of like New York in that way, where you go to like a different neighborhood, it's like a different culture. Super cool.
Absolutely.
And you know, you got to be down with the cold, but I personally am.
That's true.
I prefer cold to hot. Like, yeah, hot places I just can't. So
you can always add more layers, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah.
Cool, man. Well, thanks, Scott. Appreciate you joining and hope you have a great rest of the week.